the role of technology as a form for disinformation. And the study is based on empirical evidences on two specific cases. One is abrogation of the Article 370. Another one is the event surrounding the farmers' agitation in Delhi. There were these two substantially important political developments has been looked at in a careful manner by Vignesh. Vignesh is a doctoral student from King's College, London. He has been working on data-based, evidence-based research for quite some time. He works closely with Professor Christoph Jefferlot, and he's looking at the role of the regional parties in enhancing democracy in this part of the world. And that is his major area. And in fact, his doctoral work is on the role of the Dravidian movement and the DMK per se, and its contribution towards strengthening Indians as democracy. He had worked with data for the Ashoka University, looking at certain key determinants like caste and the way it operates in specific districts. In the run-up to the last elections, Vignesh came up with a clear interpretation of the caste-based breakups. And that gave a very, very interesting insight because it helped us to understand the impact of the 100 years of self-respect movement in breaking the stranglehold of the caste. How that stranglehold was broken was established using evidence-based approach. And since he's using this evidence-based approach, I thought that it's very, very important to look at the role of disinformation today and the power of disinformation in creating false narratives. The fact that he has taken these two defining politically substantial issues, are abrogation of Article 370 and the farmers' strike. These two issues are not being decided by the government of India or by the courts. They are actually manifesting people's will. We have seen that the farmers' bill was withdrawn, not because there was a judicial intervention. It's because people managed to stand their ground and force the government to backdraw and withdraw. And same thing is happening with Article 370 because we are not getting any judicial intervention. But the key question is, everybody is talking about a state cannot be converted into two union territories overnight. But these two issues also have a substantial sovereignty issues embedded in these two narratives, and hence it becomes really important. Thank you, Vignesh, for agreeing to talk, and it's over to you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, sir, for the opportunity. And friends here, friends online, and everybody who's shown interest, thank you very much. And as eloquently put by Paneerselvam sir, I'm trying to dabble with data in trying to understand how movements are manifesting themselves, how public spheres being managed, interpreted, and at times even manipulated, and to what ends, and what is the role of communication technology in all of this. Deep down, in an abstract manner, the idea essentially is concerted efforts and repetition, reiteration, and that's the practice of all of what you will see. And that's exactly what I went after. I went after what people were doing, what people were saying, and why they were saying. So the what and the how led me to the why. So let's I will present the abrogation of Article 370 as one case study to show you how there is concerted efforts in social media to try and manage discourses. And then the farmers movement is a case study to tell you how then this social media / digital public sphere has its, seep-ins into conventional media, and how there is an interplay to make this public sphere or discourse a lot more different than what they used to be. So, and this is a collaborative work. I work with Ajay Chandravasakam, who is an independent researcher, Tusharika Deka, who is a doctoral student at University of Nottingham, and Vihang Jumle, who is also a data engineer and now studying public policy in Hertie School. Doesn't go. Yeah. So first case study is abrogation of Article 370. And the historical context, I'm just putting it up front so that, and this is not what I'm debating now. And therefore, there's only limited attention to this. So essentially, Jammu and Kashmir is a state with different provisions. Article 370 guarantees certain special provisions for the state. And 2019, on August 5th, the Article 370 was abrogated. The state was broken up into two union territories, Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh. And the BJP referred this move as a need for development. And Prime Minister, in a series of tweets, said that this move will bring down corruption, usher in development and ease of living. So now, how are people influenced by creating an artificial interest in a debate site? And how is a for the movement or an against in other cases for a debate or a move being justified? And I focus on the site of my empirical study is Twitter. And in fact, Vihang and I have been gathering information on Twitter, about Twitter and what happens on Twitter for a while now. So what is our data set? The data set is essentially tweets associated with relevant hashtags and keywords like Article 370 between 1st August 2019 and 30th November 2019 that made to top 5 trends. So where do you find it? So essentially there is a trending tab on Twitter that you will find, and whatever appears on top 5, we try and sort of cull out that information. And to give you an idea of what or how strong Twitter is, essentially one question that might come up is how much does even Twitter, or how big is Twitter for it to influence discourse? So the answer to that will come when I explain the second case study. So at a macro level, there have been 112 hashtags, and we go after hashtags because those are easily searchable, one, and at the same time they tell you positions and they go after ideas. So hashtags stand for ideas and positions rather than going after profiles. There are also people and researchers who study profiles of people. We do not do that. We go after ideas, and this is in a certain sense a Weberian approach also. So there have been 112 hashtags relevant to Article 370's abrogation, which made it to top 5 trends. And at least once over 4 months. And of this, 58% spoke pro-abrogation, and they criticized Pakistan, the Indian National Congress, and other protests and demonstrations. Only a countable few hashtags sounded neutral in their tone. So generally, what happens is there are hashtags are generally split into 2 sides. One pro a move, one against a move. And there is also a neutral tone hashtag that goes on, which is essentially run by a few people to communicate information. So towards the end of the discussion, I will also come back to another point of, what is happening to this middle ground as well, or the neutral sounding hashtag. And when we say neutral sounding hashtag, it could just mean hashtag Article 370, nothing else to do with it. So which means generally information flows. So at a micro level, over the first 15 days of August, 31 out of the 48 hashtags conveyed a tone in favor of abrogating Article 370. And these 31 one-sided hashtags accounted for 40% of the volume of conversations over the 15 days. And in 5 days, 16 out of 26 conveyed a pro-abrogation tone, and those accounted for 49.5% of the volume. And on the day of abrogation, 12 out of 18, so which is almost 2/3, clearly conveyed a pro-abrogation stance, and accounting for over 50% of the volume. And only one hashtag spoke in the opposite tone with a volume of 4%. And this is how the coordination of efforts look like. So those are, I mean, the lines are essentially different hashtags. So they tell you that when one hashtag starts and then it reaches its peak, it dies down or it just disappears, and then another hashtag starts. So this graph tells you that at every hour of the day, how different hashtags are trending. And on the y-axis, you have volume of tweets in thousands, and all of these hashtags are, not non-neutral ones. So if you were to look at, it essentially is on the x-axis you have percentage of users, and on the y-axis you have percentage of tweets. So if you draw a 45-degree line, it clearly sort of tells you that around the 33-40% mark, you will find that there is a peak. So that is essentially the critical mass of people who are dominating this trend. So the critical mass essentially is 3,134 users, which is 3.5% of users, garnered around 236,000 retweets, and which means 36.4% of all the retweets. And to put things in perspective, we classify likes as supporting, retweets as endorsements, and replies as engagement. And 35% of 36% of all the likes and 42% of all the replies. All of this was, consolidated by the 3.5% of users. And to understand the sway, which is rather uncanny in a certain sense, you will also see how this was built up. So if you were to look at, let's say, a hashtag like Article 370, it trended on August 3rd and August 5th. And something like Operation Kashmir trended on 2nd and 3rd, but not on 4th and 5th. And then, for instance, Kashmir under threat trended on the 3rd, but none of the other days. Kashmir troop boost, for instance, trended only on the 3rd. And I Don't Stand with Amit, for instance, trended on the 1st, and no other day. So if you were to see one case, if you were to see the strongest trend, which is Operation Kashmir, that trended on 2nd and 3rd August, and the trending hashtag on 5th August, data suggests that 55.1% of all the users who tweeted for Operation Kashmir also tweeted for one of the pro-abrogation campaigns on August 5th. And a comparison between the strongest trend, which is Indian Army in Kashmir, trended on 4th August 2019, and trending hashtags on 5th August, data suggests that 25% of all users who tweeted on the 4th also tweeted on the 5th. And qualitatively, what are we finding? The intent of this concerted play on Twitter is blurring out facts. And Twitter also gives you a character limit, and threads are often not really read that much. It's always, short tweets. And in fact, in the recent past, you've also had one-word tweets that have garnered so many hits and likes and engagement in the recent past. So, and then the constitutional provisions seem to be of little relevance. So essentially, the idea of how a discourse would generally pick up in the conventional sense of, being with a few interested parties, and then, the civil society, and then a movement, and all of that is tapering out. And we do find the, an atmosphere of strongman populism, which is one person. So for instance, people who were at the helm were called Yuga Purusha, and all of these, they were compared to Swami Vivekananda, for example. And these, let's say, simplistic analogies somewhere tend to stick because they only are 8 to 10 words at best. So what then happens is when such emotionally rooted narratives become prevalent, repeated, amplified, like I told you before, it's always repetition which will lead to amplification. And there is a concerted attempt as well, and the democratic audience is bound to be disturbed and distracted from rational thought. So one point that we generally look or hear a lot, and even many of the popular journalists of late, I'm not sure if I can call them eminent, but definitely popular journalists generally pick up on the notion of freedom of expression, or freedom to put out one's opinion. In that context, here when drawing from Hannah Arendt, there is this compelling line that I've been thinking about, which is facts inform opinions, and opinions inspired by different interests and passions can differ widely and still be legitimate. So at the crux of all of this is, freedom of opinion is farcical unless factual information is guaranteed. So the idea is, if you hit the facts and if you distort facts, freedom of opinion again. And in fact, Paneerselvam sir and I were talking about the Rawlsian take to this as well, or even the take of agonistic Democrats like Chantal Mouffe. All of this fundamentally tells that, the conditionality for freedom essentially should be somewhere on the lines of truth. But in this case, when facts are distorted and meticulously done that too with the technology that is prevalent, freedom of opinion definitely becomes a weapon rather than tool. So now the next case study is of the farmers' protests. The strongest and the largest party in India is great at using Twitter for mobilization. How did it then use to tackle the farmer protests? It's a little more, complex, and it in fact is an extension of. So it's essentially again, an agile mutation, if I may say. So the data for us on this is mainstream TV debates and Twitter. Between 17th January 2021 and 17th February 2021, we show stark overlaps in conversations on Twitter and conventional TV debates, pointing at a concerted effort in constructing a certain narrative in these protests. And what does this new model imply? Such practices, orphan aggrieved communities irrespective of the gravity of their plight, and enable making of a considerably moderated public sphere, which is in turn antithetical to democratic ideals. So, which brings me back to something that I'd left out, or I promised to come back to, which is how strong is then Twitter, or how dominant can Twitter be? Twitter does not really have 50 or 60 crore Indians on it, but then there are TV viewers as well. And there is a seeping in of what's happening on the digital platform into the conventional platforms as well. And there is also a large mass of people that are consuming information on their phones in short bits. You can call them reels, you can call them shorts, depending on the platform. So the timeline, the Honorable President signs the agricultural ordinances on June 2020. The protests gain momentum in July. Bills are passed in the parliament in September. Farmers march into New Delhi in November. And there is mass media coverage that intensifies. And the period of our inquiry is mid-Jan 2021 to mid-February. Broad observations: biased reporting to dismiss farmers' woes. And then secondly, setting narratives simultaneously, and expanding the sphere of influence on social media. So what are the broad narratives between November 2020 and February 2021? Opposition politicizing the protest. Protesters are undemocratic and unethical in their approach. International organized conspiracy. This is around the time when people like Rihanna and Greta Thunberg, etc., entered the debate. And other minor narratives like protests losing momentum, and only limited instances that criticize the government. So Existing media space is and this has been put out by many media experts as well. So there is a certain sense of a monopolistic approach in, who owns media, etc. And this union then acts as a critical mass that sets the narrative in motion. What are the recent observations? A deliberate attempt to construct a social media model like the existing television media model to allow media union to saturate the online public discourse with their narratives. So media seeps into digital seeps into media. So in a certain sense, how does a mass media ecosystem function? You have, this is a figurative approach. So you have newspapers and TV persons telling people information. But in the case of social media, there is a certain sense of back and forth that can happen. There is a certain element of anonymity. But now what's happening is there is a critical mass that's being built, and people are being approached in that sense. So riding on the back of its critical mass, the TV handle in question is the Republic channel, pushes and saturates certain narrative in the mainstream conversation. So we had tried, and so on every primetime debate that the channel has, there is a hashtag that comes out. So if you were to look at the 21 hashtags, there were 25.9 thousand tweets, 9.7 thousand users were there. So 66 users, or 0.68%, made 6.5 thousand tweets, which is 25%. So less than a percentage account for 25%. And that is almost 900 tweets per user on average. So if you again look at the 45-degree line, it cuts at somewhere around 30, 31, and because this is a smaller trend, you do see that sustaining itself till the end. So you see that 60% of tweets is by 36, and also by 70, and also by 100. So the slope is not that steep. And how is it then made mainstream? So these 66 users accounted for 51% of all retweets, which is endorsements, 61% of the support, which is likes, and 65% of replies, which is engagement. Now to put it on its head, what if these 66 were genuine? The argument can always be that, now that's just correlation. What is it? How are you sure? So to make the correlation a lot more stronger, we tried to put the 66 R theory on its head and try to sort of understand, are these people then tweeting on hashtags that are similar? So for instance, if one hashtag is called Republic Exposes Greta, the other hashtag on the same lines is Greta Thunberg Exposed. So are these users then tweeting? Are they? In fact, then we realized that across all of this, people were actually not tweeting to the parallel tweets or to the parallel hashtags. So essentially, what we realized was the hashtags that were perpetuated or put forth by the channel were only being sort of, picked up by these critical mass. So which means they're not really interested in the issue per se, because if one understands Twitter algorithms, then the idea is as many parallel hashtags, as many people, as many likes, as many retweets, as much engagement will then push you organically up. But in this case, it was not. And we actually had we studied 5 parallel trends, and it actually did not. There was no resonance between the two hashtags in each of these 5 instances. And what then are the implications? So this social media model to rebuild the forging of this social media model to rebuild as a television media model it has its own problems, because it disrupts healthy public sphere. And the model of reconstruction is evident after mainstream media celebrated Twitter's move to temporarily suspend a few pro-farmer handles. So that was our other finding. And the rise of opposition-free echo chambers that fuels polarization. So the idea is not that if I do not have an other, or if I do not have my contender, my debate will fail, or I will not attract more people. The argument then is, if I do not have a person who's saying no to what I'm saying, then I will be able to make my concentric circle, or my core support group, and the next concentric circle, and the concentric circle after that, a lot more stronger and more invested. So the idea is repeated bombarding. And that's exactly why platforms like Coup, for instance, which is essentially becoming like that, is also important to study and not really ignore. Because the point is, there was a point in time where people were interested in debating, and it is always okay to have angry people willing to debate rather than quiet people not willing to debate or not willing to engage in a conversation at all, which means they're convinced of something. And when that something stands against the grain of, the larger constitutional ethos of the country, then that will become a problem in itself. So closing remarks, I would like to sort of draw upon two academicians that we picked up. One is a journalist turned book writer. So Jamie Bartlett, in his book People versus Tech, provided insight about how social media platforms have proven to be more than just tools for socialization and communication. So in fact, he says the fact that the platform asks you, or warrants you to be brief, in the name of brevity, we're actually losing a lot of nuance. And the moment you lose nuance, it is easy for someone to become right and the other person to become wrong. And this fundamental understanding of life between rights and wrongs, and that being the only understanding of issues, complex issues like this, for instance, a complex issue being treated or being met with a farcical binary, a binary driven answer, is essentially antithetical to both the aggrieved party and also the protesters or the people invested in the aggrieved parties. So the very idea of life being, a function of, a 0.4 to 0.6 rather than a 0.1 or 0.99 is essentially dissipating with time and with extensive engagement with social media. And Sean Rosenberg, in fact, professor of UC Irvine, in fact, he'd in 2019, if I am not wrong, he'd presented in the International Political Psychologists Conference, and he wrote a rather cynical paper. In a certain sense, he said democracy will devour itself because there is a rise of incompetent citizens. So he puts out 3 points where there are populism will tend to push and further your existing biases. It will give simplistic binaries to complex issues as answers. And the third one is it will make you feel empowered even with little information. So democracy, so he then moves on to the idea of democracy being a commitment, which is to read, to understand, and it's a constant effort. It's almost like exercise. If you don't work out every day, if you don't eat, it's almost like eating. If you don't work out every day, if you don't eat every day, on the same lines, if you don't work towards democratic ethos every day, then democracy tends to devour itself. It can easily swing to, populism, and that to electorally mandated populism, which is a lot more legitimate if the citizenry does not come up against the issues prevalent. So the point is, Twitter's importance is rather undeniable of late. And apart from these two case studies, we've also gone after a couple of other case studies, like, say, when students or aspirants of public service examinations went after the government to sort of, to make them accountable and then give out results. We then saw that sort of a concerted effort, in fact, making or yielding results. So it's not as if this is a method that is exclusive. This method is essentially it works both ways. So all we need is someone who's as dedicated and someone who's willing to be invested, or a group of people that is sort of willing to be invested. And but is that happening? Not really, as far as we see. We do have a few cases in Tamil Nadu where it is working. So, okay, Tamil Nadu is a case study where it actually works for the other side. And then the case of students is one where it worked. But then, in spite of these examples, are there efforts that are being put forth to engage? Not really sure, because at least the data does not tell us enough to be sure of it. And again, the solution is as was suggested by the both of them, is about how people are going to treat information and form opinions. Are people willing to sort of go the extra effort or do a bit of reading? Let's say pick up. Now, even a lot of opinion articles on reputed newspapers like the Hindu, the Express, are all being put forth in video format for UPSC aspirants to sort of consume, and that's put out on YouTube free of cost. So are at least people willing to sort of, log into one of those channels, and then just, even if not read, at least listen? Is there that 10-15 minute effort on every day, or even a half an hour effort every day across, let's say, 4 years, which will actually make voters a lot look or think a lot different than they actually are now? This had happened in this region, as I am documenting now in my doctoral thesis, and has also been recorded by Professor Francis Cody in 2 different instances. I'm looking at the decades of 50s and 60s, and Francis Cody looked at 90s and 2000s. So there was a movement here, which means it is replicable. So, but then data, at least so far, suggests that, or makes a very compelling case for such a movement to sort of come back. But will it happen is for us to wait and see. On that note, thank you very much.
You can sit there, please. See, there is one issue is the role of technology. Till Arab Spring, technology was seen as an enabler. And post-Arab Spring, technology is seen as a controlling tool. There was a shift which happens around 2010-11, becomes so crucial. And that becomes central to understanding of how we are going to look at technology. While we are talking about this abrogation of Article 370 and the way technology was used in the rest of the India, you should also remember around that time, people of Jammu and Kashmir had no access to any information because there was an internet shutdown. So at some level, technology is also a highly centralizing tool. There was this idea of digital disruption, which was supposed to decentralize information, and idea of these multinodal information pools, which was imagined initially, is now converted into a extremely centralized structure where state can control. If the state wants, it can switch off specific IP addresses. It happened with complete state of Jammu and Kashmir, it happened in Jharkhand, it happened in Chhattisgarh, and it happened in specific districts of West Bengal in the run-up to the last general election. Given this fact, how do you look at disinformation not reaching people for whom the information is meant for?
Check. So, in fact, the disinformation, in as far as we see it so far, is trying to sort of, sidestep or even evade the aggrieved parties in many cases. When the aggrieved parties are trying to question the state, the people pro-establishment are very happy to not even have them in the in the discourse itself. So, for instance, the internet shutdown, while you might see it as being very, very antithetical to even the idea of debate, but the question in turn is, are they even willing to have that debate? As far as we understand it, they are not willing to have it. And from my little experience in trying to sort of consult for political parties for elections, etc., there are very few political parties that fortunately I've had the good fortune to work with who are interested in what the other side is saying. But generally, it is about how are we going to crowd out the system. Doesn't matter who looks at it, doesn't matter who does not look at it. It's about, okay, let me crowd it out because I have the resource. And then let's just see what then happens. And that's exactly why you saw so many hashtags in that graph that I had shown. There's one hashtag that goes up, and then the next hour is another hashtag altogether. And the idea also flips back to the time duration of a news cycle. With the coming of 24/7 news channels, with the coming of social media and all of this, in the past, the news cycle used to be at least 12 to 30 hours long. The shortest news cycle would be 12 hours, and the longest news cycle would be 30 hours, which means there was at least one full day across the world where people could simultaneously debate about something. But now it is shrunk so much to 6 hours, between 1 and 6 hours. So if you manage to trend yourself for 6 hours, then it means that you actually done your bit, because the algorithms and the system essentially moves on to the next trend then. And that's exactly why we went after top 5 trends every day, to at least account for or top 4 or top 5 rather than top 1 trend of the day. Because Twitter then asks you, okay, top trend of which hour slot, which time period. So yes, and with this system, then it is always easy to sort of centralize as well, isn't it? If the system is primed to be in the way that there are going to be metrics, as we have seen. If the metrics continue to exist this way, then centralization is possible. And at the same time, if someone is not willing to engage in a debate, then they will continue to use this as one of the. For instance, it is as if running a newspaper without a letter spread editor channel. So, for instance, invested journalists would want a letter spread editor column. But what about the popular ones, not the invested ones? The adjectives change, but the popularity remains.
See, in your study, did you notice any focus on the failures of the institutions? Like, say, the failure of the parliament to discuss these issues threadbare, or about the failure of the judiciary to look at the substantial legal issues? The institutional failure, the failure of the mainstream media not raising its voice adequately. In your when you're keeping this idea of looking at the trends, the failure was also so glaring. Did this come up in your study, or is there any hint about these glaring failures?
In fact, in terms of volume, no volume. But qualitatively, if I may say, the speech delivered by Professor Srinath Raghavan in Manthan around that time, which garnered a good popularity in YouTube and all of that. It's a long lecture. That was attacked at the start in one of these pro-abrogation articles, hashtags. They actually went after Srinath's video. But then they were quickly careful enough to basically not engage with it at all. So the number of people who are trying to push, let's say something like, Srinath's piece or Srinath's video are far lesser than people who would come back and then say, oh, I stand with India. I am against Pakistan, for instance. And what will end up happening also is the people who quote tweet. Now there is an idea of quote tweeting, isn't it? Which is, let's say you put out something against what was happening. So I quote tweet you, and then I have 4 pro-abrogation hashtags. All the 240 characters will only be hashtags, which means the algorithm will push my tweet above yours. So the idea is to sidestep, not really engage at all. and many replies to people who said, "Oh, what about federalism?" For instance, my co-author Jayan Nathan and I had also written a piece for The Wire. So the counter was, are you with India or Pakistan? And there are 7 replies to it. And there is another thing saying, "Oh, don't we know about what Tamil Nadu has done?" There's the hashtags that go after, Tamil Nadu, then they go after Annadurai, they go after Kalangi Karnanadi, and then they come. So the idea is to populate the system, populate the discourse with as much, spurious talk as possible. And then when you start engaging, when you start responding, they're essentially hammers, and you're just a nail. They're not even willing to sort of, steer you and then hammer you in. They're just trying to hammer you. That's all. So imagine getting the same response for 7 different replies of yours. I've seen many people very active, one such colleague of mine from the US is also doing her research on what is happening to the health of these activists. And I'd actually suggested that she should do that in India as well, because I've seen many activists who've invested themselves into this, creating, primers, writing articles, writing short notes, putting out videos, and then trying to engage with the hammers. And they end up with their blood pressure high. And they give up at some point. And that's because of fatigue. It's just fatigue. 100 people on the other side, and then they're saying the same thing over and over and over. And I'm thinking of 100 different answers. And I still have to go round 2 with the same 100 questions.
I will take some questions from the internet, online participants. We'll get some questions from the internet. What's the name of the participant? Sundar, you can go ahead and ask your question, please. Sundar? We're going on. We'll take a question from here before we go. Anybody here?
Yeah,
Please.
I have a question. You spoke about the agile mutatability. How does one, and you spoke about agile mutatability, and you also gave that sort of list of hashtags that they just went after the ones that were created. There wasn't a broad spectrum engagement with the issue, even though they were at the behest of, do that. It wasn't a broad spectrum interest. They went after, specific, to create specific hashtags. So a combination of this agile mutatability plus this kind of ability to pour funds in and have specific hashtags trending. How does one address this without a larger democratic or a savvy democratic engagement with Twitter? Like we mentioned earlier that, for example, when some things trend in Tamil Nadu, there is a broader base that engages with it. So unless one creates a broader base that is savvy on Twitter, it seems like that it is, really always the system is rigged to the other side quite perpetually. So that's my sort of observation question.
Thank you, ma'am. So there's no other way. In short, you either are very, very tech savvy and then go after, but there are also limits to this. So for instance, I guess we did speak about Tamil Nadu, and a couple of co-authors of mine, and I published a piece in EPW as well on that, to say that the 45-degree line in the graph that you had seen would be skewed more to the right, which means there's a broader group of people who are engaging here. But that's because of the investment of people in the idea of Tamil Nadu and in the idea of democracy in Tamil Nadu, for instance. So it boils down to how many people are committed to what they're and what are they committed to. And now, and in fact, in that paper also we had quoted, there was a hashtag when what happens when you do it in a savvy manner. But that was not really savvy. That was very bad. That was just brute force of money. So there was a hashtag called. So this was at the time where there were hashtags on the lines of Vetrivel, Veeravel, and then Kandanukku Arogara and things like that. Which means so it was actually the hashtags were against the supporters of the Dravidian movement who went after a prayer song of Lord Muruga. And in that, what happened is, so Vetrivel Veeravel is a hashtag that was broadly put up on these lines. So 20, 30, 40 users coming up with, 10,000, 15,000 tweets, retweets, etc. But then there was veteran actor Rajnikant who put out a hashtag called Kandanukku Arogara, just one tweet. And it had almost 300,000 engagement in a matter of 2 hours. But all of it was geographically dominated in Belarus, which means it's just bot activity. So Twitter is also running purges of it. So for people who extensively spend in one go, there are purges. So there are purges on bots as well. There are purges on fake accounts and etc. So in one such Twitter purge, the entire hashtag went down. The hashtag stopped existing after 4 hours. So even if we go back and search, then it means you won't find anything. So there is a limit to being savvy, and there is also a limit to putting in money also. Even if you are the largest spender, you actually need to have people backing. And one interesting point also, which again from my thesis, in the politics or the political engagement or investment in people here for the last 100 years has been an outcome of multiple social movements and asking questions. And at the same time, believing in the idea of democracy, believing in dissent, belief in, belief in diversity, belief in difference. So because there has been, a certain embracing of difference here, are we able to sustain it? Else, I don't see another way to do this. Yeah, I mean, my limited understanding, I think, if not for social movements, people's investment, I don't think. This is just an amplifier. So people behind all of this, so there might be, let's say, 66 people controlling or 4% of people controlling 40% of the engagement. But who are those guys who are doing the hits, the likes, the retweets, and the replies? So those are the guys who are following. That's actually a big follower base, which we are missing, and which is an outcome of a fundamental definition of politics, which is the finality of politics is actually engagement with the common public. And that's happening day in, day out in every place where the parties in question, be it in the south, in the north, etc., are successful.
Hello. I just want to understand the base of this. So the consumption of media is the base problem of this. Is that right?
Now, that's a very tricky question. No. If media is understood as a tool towards bringing people accountable, towards making people accountable, then you will have very different outcomes. If your parameters are about how many people are watching you, then media becomes a tool for something else. Because at the end of it, you need to sustain yourself. Isn't it? Here, it's about how many people are watching you. So therefore, I'm willing to give you money to put my product out there. And also, if I help you put out X or Y ideas, then I will get Z favors. Again, no, the idea is not, the problem is not the media. No. Problem is, what are we trying to do with media? And what are the people in media trying to do with it? We still see invested journalists across the spectrum.
Just a minute, I have another question.
Sorry.
So this the analytics you said and the critical mass. This critical mass is same everywhere on other platforms also. So this is on Twitter only.
Facebook is a different beast altogether. There is so much subaltern engagement in Facebook, which many people tend to miss out. And yeah, I mean, Facebook needs to be understood, yes. But broadly, as far as we have seen, there is also a certain sense of viability for our research. So we saw if we are actually going we are going against the grain of Facebook or not. When we realize we are on the same grain, then our findings are only different on the lines of magnitude, but we are on the same direction. So Twitter definitely tells you what is happening. Facebook just shows you the mirror, telling that, brother, you're dying. Twitter tells you, oh, you might. Please take care. Yes, please.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for your very fascinating study. And I think my question also relates a little bit to the analysis and your, so in part 2, when you were talking about the farmers' protest, now you also kind of said in that slide, you talked about if these people were real users. So the implication being that, and Mr. Paneerselvam in his introduction also said that these are not state-sponsored, and these are people tweeting on their own accord. I will put that in quotes. Now, how do we really establish this? So if we are saying that this whole model of media, this pro-government media, is trying to be replicated on this new platform, on Twitter, how do we really establish this correlation? Because a lot of people actually, I work on a very similar area, but one of the questions that comes up again and again is how do you really establish that these are people who are not genuine users, or they are fake IDs created by the party or the government?
Great. Is there any other question? Great. So the correlation is to the extent that there is a concerted effort. And as I mentioned just now, the question is not about how many fake users are doing this. The idea is there are real people typing all of this for us. Who are the invested people? They can be party sympathizers, they can be cause sympathizers, etc. The idea of that political organization is to bring these people together, is to aggregate. And they have aggregated a very small core group of people who can make so much noise. So, for instance, and what happened is, and the difference between the trends that I had shown and the trends on the other side is that, and Facebook, you asked about Facebook, I'll answer a little more about that as well. So many farmer activists, farmers, and etc. were using Facebook there. There were fewer Twitter users. So Twitter was essentially amplifying what was happening on Facebook. So they were basically going after all hashtags that are prevalent. So for them, a normal farmer activist tweet will have 3 or 4 hashtags that are similar. But in this case, there was only one, which means there's a blinkered approach to say that, oh, this is my job, I will do this, and someone else will. It's almost like a relay race. It is not like, a team sport where everybody is running towards the ball. It's essentially that, oh, I will pick this up, I will make some noise, and 10 hours later, there'll be someone else who will pick up the baton, they will make some noise, and then 15 hours later, there'll be someone else. So this blinkered and concerted approach is what differentiates the two sides. And the argument is not anymore about bots doing this in so many quantities. Yes, bots end up being, amplifiers to a certain extent, but not to the extent of this much dominance. Because there is also on the side of, there's also efforts on the side of platforms to try and curtail all of this. They now ask a lot of people for phone numbers. They ask people for, at times identification, another email ID and all of that. And if the account is not logged in for at least 5 to 10 days, then they'll ask you why you did not log in and all of this. So by doing all of that, you actually have to have people behind them. So the game is only about anonymity rather than, if the person is there or there is definitely a person who's invested. And yeah. Yes, please.
Hello. The political parties breaking the truth and building their own narratives. But you also gave the solution that citizens should invest more time in understanding stuff. But is it possible for a normal citizen to be a public intellectual like a doctor student like you? Or rather, my solution would be, why can't the opposition political parties use the same propaganda techniques to educate people?
It has been, sorry, finish, please finish.
So my question is, we should invest the public to become an intellectual or to capture the power and just use the power to do the good things. That's my question.
There are many, many landmines in your question, but I will. The first thing is this idea of, a casual, a normal, an innocent citizen. It is such a farce. And in Tamil Nadu, it is being sold by one of the biggest characters that we look up to today, Mr. Shankar, to say that, there is a big hegemonic creation there, and there is this very ordinary citizen here. Democracy fundamentally, 20 years before his coming or his style of movies coming, there were movies trying where every ordinary person was trying to question the system. And you look at any work done, and in fact, was about, how people could ask questions. And asking questions was promoted. So this idea of, a very timid citizen is such a movie construct, which needs to be lived, which needs to be outlived. The idea is, do you have your opinion straight? Have you worked to build an opinion? And that's all that matters. You essentially have three moments, which is a state election, which is a national election, and then which is a local body election. You have 3 instances to sort of, exercise your opinion there. And if you actually have a family around you, you talk to them about what you think. And that's all. If you look at a few other studies, the politicization of people was what led to this kind of an outburst on this side. And on the other side, depoliticization of people is what led to us becoming, mute in a certain sense, or not having answers to questions. A generation of parents decided that their children should not get political. And what that political was, I still don't know. I'm still trying to get my head around it. So what essentially happened was, and depoliticization essentially is also a political stand. So calling yourself apolitical is also political. We're trying to dabble multiple things here. And again, when you say truth is being blurred, when I actually said truth is being blurred out, there's also goalpost shifting. So imagine you're coming to talk to me about, let's say farmers protest and saying that, well, the RTI essentially is a banker that gives money to the farmer whenever he needs it. And it's essentially a barter in a certain sense. Now, then I will turn back and then flip it and say, well, will the farmers' bills bring development or no? Tell me yes or no. Then you'd say no. Then I will then tell you that, are you supporting Indian farmers or Khalistani farmers? Then you will say Indian farmers. Then they will say, if you're supporting Indian farmers, why then are you not willing to agree that this will ensure development of farmers? Then you'd say, why are these two conditional? Why is one conditional to the other? Then they will say, well, it is. Are you willing to buy this or no? So it is all this package deal sales. to say that one leads to the other, leads to the other, leads to the other. So therefore, you end up in that chain. And yes, opposition parties have been doing it. There are many parties that have been doing it. But then, and everywhere such parties have done, they've ensured success. Even you take the election of 2019, states where there were three things. One, we talk about this Hindu wave or majoritarian wave. Forget it being Hindu or something else. There's been a majoritarian wave sweeping the parliament. Every state where people found an alternative, people had actually voted. And there are three things to this in my limited understanding. One is connect with people, an organized and a disciplined party cadre, and discourse management, which is your discourse around how strong is your discourse management, irrespective of it being on issues or on identity, etc. Start Punjab, and then you think of Andhra Pradesh, you think of Tamil Nadu, everywhere, and even before that, state elections, 2015, Bihar. A lot of people here like to bash Bihar. I'm not really pro that because they have consistently been, sincere to the idea of secular politics. Yeah, except for a few disjuncture with the liberal offering, but then yeah, they've been very secular, or at least they've been anti-majoritarian in the simplest of forms. So you look for examples, you actually will find them. And these three are markers that the lowest common multiple that I saw across these across spectrums. And in Tamil Nadu, there is something called the Dravidian Model Workshop that's happening. And on culture, there is the Neidal Festival, Thoothukudi Cultural and Arts Festival. There is work that's happening. And in Delhi, there is Thana level committees. Jan Sunwai means public hearings. And in West Bengal, there was something called DDK Bolo. Yeah, political parties are doing. Sorry, West Bengal is another case that I missed.
See, before we wrap up, there is a very fine book by Mila Philippos. It's called The Media Shifting Terrain, where she actually documents the role of mainstream media in valorizing the apolitical approach of India against corruption. It is essentially a study about the sway of India against corruption and its apolitical nature, which got invested in the public sphere. What do you learn from that shifting media terrain? Because she says that the biggest danger of the India against corruption is apoliticization becomes a norm for a ethical political behavior. And the way that has been packaged and sold is the biggest threat. That's what she documents in the book. How do you look at this entire narrative? And how do you think that feeds into the social media and into this multiple generation of information?
In short, it paves way for homogenization of an entire public that was otherwise diverse in its thought, action, belief, and faith. In the sense that if you focus all your attention on governance and delivery of public services, then politics is nothing but a civil society organization manifesting as something else. Accountability, governance, delivery come from think tanks and civil society organizations. Politics is essentially a space where multiplicity of ideas, plurality of thought, and existence are being discussed, debated, only to let them sustain further. So this idea of, oh, I am apolitical, but I believe in A, B, C things means I am leaving a big open void for a cultural appropriation of the masses. And I'm stripping away general public's investment in politics, in their day-to-day affairs. And then I'm switching all of it out to an entire, Excel sheet of metrics that talk about how many households did I cover in how many days, how much money did I save in giving free rice, rather than, how many cultures have I, conserved, how many cultural bigots have I taken on, and so on. It just shifts bases.
Thank you, Vignesh. One last question. Yes, please.
What do you think is the impact of increasing number of characters from 140 to 280 by Twitter? And it happened during the year 2017. So what is the impact it made on the disinformation phenomenon?
I am happy. I'm even happy for Twitter to host many more words. The impact is that, and now there is something called threads, and there is another bot in Twitter that basically arranges your threads in a certain way so that it can be read by people and all of that. So all of it will only help you consume one set of information at one time, giving you some space for more nuance. So it is a welcome move in simple terms. But then the question, the flip side question will be that if it's going to be an entire, if there is no character limit, so how does it differentiate itself from a blog? So I agree. But then the consumer of such information also needs to exercise some discretion, because at the crux of the entire neoliberal offering is that the consumer is king, or what sells is what runs. So if there is a demand for multiple threads, then you will find apps that will aggregate threads. So if you create that kind of a demand, for example, there is a website called Linktree, which provides multiple links in one link, which means there was a demand for that, isn't it? So I can't give out, for instance, let's say, there's something called Muckrack, just for independent journalists. They don't really want to sort of draw up 10 links to their next employer or their grant association. Instead, they would just give one link of Muckrack, or one link, or now for celebrities, it's just one link saying that, oh, Instagram, I have 100,000, Twitter, I have 500,000, Facebook, I have 2 million, but here's my link tree, you will find my popularity in one link. So yes, as much as we are looking for supply side changes, because again, supply side changes have their own, motivations. But one important and, definitive motivation is what sells. And I think that needs to be exploited a little more if you'd want your way. This is essentially, this entire presentation is about how 10 or 15 people woke up every day in the morning, thought that I need to say these things to people, irrespective of what the outcome is. They've been doing it for 10 years and you see outcomes. Yeah.
See, as a journalist, we all are concerned about the lack of space for credible information. We saw it gaining ground around the time the Brexit debate got accentuated. But today we have reached a stage where you don't need to have any credible information as long as information is attractive, which is a completely new reality. Therefore, we have moved into a completely new era, and I don't think people sometimes ask, what are the editors doing? The editor's job is to see whether what they're putting out is confirmed. But how can you confirm when the head of the country is not going to come up with a credible information? Where is the question of confirmation comes in? If our GDP numbers are suspect, if the way we are computing our various data are suspect, the way the base year has been shifted has become such a debate. In this environment, what you have said about credible information is so important, because credible information is the only basic thing which can bring all of us together to have a democratic society. Thank you for this.
Thank you very much.
Vignesh.
Thank you. Thank you.
See, there's just one more question. Do you read out
I'll
the
read the question, sir.
Yeah.
It's a question from Naomi. Do you have a concept or vision of how social media can be used to foster healthy, productive public forums with respect to democracy and politics? Are there examples from your research or consulting that you can draw on?
So the activists that we see on day in, day out, the civil society organizations, the invested people, they just need to start hiring people to do this online as well. That is the short answer to this. The larger answer or the more abstract answer would be the investment that you have on ground needs to find amplification in every other element. So history has told us that people who have dabbled with technology have grown because the ideas that they've had, print culture, for instance, print capitalism, etc. Technology is changing and you need to keep pace. The people with best of intentions need to sort of take on these handles and just start doing. There definitely not be in our hashtags that we are looking at on day one, but at least in day 15 and day 20, or at least or year 2 or year 3, they will definitely find space. That needs to happen. And examples is that, like I told you, there is the students, the aspirants, the aspirant community who are after rail exams, SSB, the Service Staff Selection Board exam. Yeah, SSB exams. So they picked up they picked up Twitter and then made sure that the government had some response or the other because they're waiting for 4 to 5 years. And for many of these people, marriages, societal respect, future, all of it is conditional on just one result: yes or no. Do I actually? There's one student who told me, do I actually have to go back to my father's departmental store, or will I become an officer? Depends on this exam that I've been waiting to hear for 5 years. And therefore, sir, I will tweet from morning 10 o'clock to night 10 o'clock. And he kept tweeting. There were 5,000 other students. There were 100 other faculty across this board who said, okay, we will help you students. And eventually there was a response from the secretary, from the concerned secretary, saying that the results will come out. So yes.
Thank you, Ignesh. Thank you. Bye.